Webinar title, Fundamentals of Change and Implementation in Child Welfare Information Systems. Webinar date, August 30th, 2023, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Children's Bureau Division of State Systems logo, and a QR code for participants to participate in forming a word cloud on change management.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We will get started in just a moment, but we want to thank you for being with us today. Welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series, brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. My name is Philip Breitenbuscher, and I am your host for today's webinar. Today's discussion is entitled Fundamentals of Change and Implementation in Child Welfare Information Systems. Before we get started today, we want to encourage you to participate in the forming of a word cloud on change management. If you take a look at your screen now, you'll see a few ways that you can engage and participate in this word cloud. Probably the easiest way would be to use the QR code on your phone. And just take a quick shot of that. Should take you right to the Mentee page where you can give us a few words. Another way to participate would be to click on the link that's just now posted in the chat by Kim. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate that. Or you can go directly to the Mentee website at www.mentee.com and enter the code 46497654. All right. We look forward to seeing your responses and encourage your participation there. I'm giving you just a moment to grab that link, and then I'm going to move forward and talk about some additional ways you can participate in today's webinar.
Slide title, Participating in today's webinar. On-screen text demonstrating how to participate is explained by moderator. Questions can be emailed to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov.
To ask questions for today's presentation, please use the Q&A feature, which should be located in the Zoom ribbon, either at the top or the bottom of your screen. It looks similar to the icon to my right of my screen. There we will be able to respond to all questions. We will ask if you do drop those into chat to move those to the Q&A feature. If you would like to ask a question live, you can use the raise hand feature. And then one of us will privately message you in chat. Make sure that you are ready to ask that question live. And at that point, we will enable your line to be able to unmute yourself. We will call upon you. You can ask your question. And then once you're done, we'll go ahead and mute your line again. And if you've joined us by phone, you can also participate and raise your hand using the *9 feature. And that'll also allow us to unmute your line so that you can ask questions. If at the end of today's webinar you have additional questions, you are welcome to submit those to CWIS or CCWIS.questions@acf.hhs.gov. Again, we really do encourage your active participation in today's webinar, and so please send us a question and/or raise your hand, and also please participate in our Mentee word cloud.
Slide title, Agenda. Bulleted agenda items are read by moderator.
Here's a quick overview of today's agenda. We'll start first with introductions of our speakers. Then we'll provide an overview of change and implementation, or C&I principles, the importance of C&I. We'll discuss the benefits of C&I for child welfare information systems projects. We'll talk about the staff involvement in change and implementation. We'll look at mapping change and implementation to CCWIS tools. We'll conclude today with some additional resources that we want to leave you with, and then we'll also leave some time for question and answers. Lastly, I just want to say towards the end of today's webinar, there'll be a chance for you to give us some feedback. We'll drop a link into the chat towards the end. There's also a link that will take you to when you close out of today's webinar, but your feedback on these webinars is very important to us, so we hope that you do take the opportunity to complete the evaluation.
Slide title, Introductions. Presenter names are read by moderator.
All right. Before I do jump into today's introductions of our presenters, I want to acknowledge the storms that are impacting the southeast of our country today. And let you know that those folks, even our brothers and sisters and compadres in the field of child welfare, are being impacted, and we lift them up. I also want to acknowledge that one of our presenters, Jessica, is actually in Georgia, and so if she drops off for a moment due to the storm, we'll do our best to get her back on. But we wanted to let you know that she's there. So let me go ahead and introduce our presenters today. Our first presenter will be Brady Birdsong. He is Federal Contract Support to the DSS team. And then next, I'm pleased to introduce to you Jessica Walls. She is with the Capacity Building Center for States. Excuse me there. So welcome to our presenters. All right, Brady?
Yes, thank you, Phil. Thank you for that great introduction. And hello, everyone. I am very excited to be here with you today and presenting on what I think is a really interesting topic for those of us in child welfare information systems. I spent 15 years or so working in the District of Columbia back in the CCWIS days, so it was a few years ago. But I really, as we were working on this webinar and on this tool, I realized how valuable this information would have been while I was doing the work that I was doing with the District of Columbia. And one of the things I was thinking is everything we do in this work is really a change, right? Whether we're doing a large system implementation, a big bang implementation of a CCWIS, or even if it's just modifying an existing system to meet a new policy or practice, we are implementing and informing change within the agency, right? And we may not always do it through a structured process, but having sort of a structured framework by which we think about our change and implementation is really critical for the success of what we're doing. And so I'm not an expert in change and implementation, but that's why we partner and collaborate with other folks in the child welfare field. And I'm really excited to have Jessica Walls from the Capacity Building Center for States with us today. And I'm going to let her introduce herself. Hey, Jess.
Hey, Brady. And hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Walls. As Brady mentioned, I currently serve as the lead for Universal Services at the Capacity Building Center for States. As an extension of CB's technical assistance, our team works alongside and in support of state staff, individuals with lived experience and expertise, and direct service teams to produce a variety of publications, tools, digital resources, and learning experiences. All of these are aimed at improving how we support children, young people, and families. And like Brady, I've spent more than 15 years in human services in that space, working with a variety of federal, state, and local organizations to improve the well-being of individuals and communities. And Brady, you said it, so often that work ties back to how we approach and manage change. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about that. The center's change and implementation approach, it's really foundational to the capacity building work that we do. And through my work, I've had the opportunity to learn from and observe what's truly possible when we take a structured approach to change. I'm excited, like I mentioned, to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing in collaboration with the Division of State Systems team to support all of you.
All right. Thank you, Jess. So before we really get into the details of this presentation on change and implementation, let's go to the word cloud if we could and just...
Slide title, Audience Poll Number 1, Word Cloud. Poll question read by presenter. QR code is shown on screen for participants to respond.
For folks who, if you haven't been able to scan the QR code and get in there, please try to do that as soon as possible. If you can't bring it up and you want to just drop a word or two in the chat, you can do that as well. But we really want you to think about when you think about change management, what comes to mind? Just a couple of words.
Word cloud and poll questions are shown on screen. The page is refreshed several times to show live updates to the word cloud. Some of the largest words include resistance, challenging, collaborative, communication, progress, and buy-in.
All right. Oh, we've got great participation. I'm seeing resistance in the middle of the word cloud. New success. I like that. Jess, anything standing out for you?
Definitely some key terms: buy-in, engagement, collaboration, or being collaborative. Definitely love the participation.
As is and to be process management. I like that. Expensive engagement. Ooh. Right. Process management.
And Brady, I just wanted to jump in and let you know
Yes.
that we have 111 attendees and we're already at 122 responses. So I'm seeing some really great engagement here.
Great. All right. Well, I think this is interesting because I think we're seeing a lot of some of the words are more about the human response to change, like the resistance, communication challenging, time, set of procedures, seeing lack of tech resources, process management. This is good. So, Jess, when I think if we want to wrap this up, we can move on. And Jess, when you think, and the center is talking about change and implementation, what do you all mean by that?
Absolutely. So I saw a lot of words that were about the experience of change.
Slide title: A Tale of Two Paths. A cartoon image of a man walking on a singular path approaching a fork in the road with two different paths with arrows pointing to each. A question mark is near the man's head.
And I think that this is a big component of it, right? This is the work of people. It's the work of teams. And so I'm a big fan of stories. So I'm going to tell a story to get us started. And as I do, I want you all to think about what resonates most with you and with your own experiences. And as we continue, please continue to engage with us in the chat. If we say something that's really resonant, oh, yes, I've experienced that, definitely feel that as well. Please pop it in the chat. Let us know if this connects with anything that you've experienced. So, a tale of two paths. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. Well, I mean, that's how somebody described it in a famous poem. In this case, both roads begin by identifying a problem or a need and ultimately lead to change. On the first path, we move quickly. We're really eager to find the solution and to take action to remedy what we've found. And we may make decisions more independently to save time. We implement solutions we might not have taken the time to research. We find ourselves informing those we serve more about the solution than we're asking what the solution should be. And while we're definitely successful in making change, we're not quite seeing the impact we expected. Perhaps we're finding that we have to backtrack, that we're spending extra resources, we're hearing the solution isn't quite right, we're having trouble sustaining momentum and buy-in. In short, we're a bit tired and a little frustrated. And I saw that a lot in the word cloud. On the second path, we decide to take a more structured approach to change, and we take time to understand as much as we can about the problem. We invite others into the discussion to help us think through what we know and where we need to go. We identify solutions that are data informed, and we pause at key milestones for discussion and consensus building with those who are most impacted by the change. We do this before we design and implement our solution. And we're able to make incremental changes along the way and stay in alignment. On this path, it doesn't eliminate the need for all adjustment. But we've got the flexibility and we feel like we've got the momentum we need to do those changes over time. Do either of these scenarios sound familiar to you? If so, how did you feel when you took either of these paths? Please let us know in the chat. Love to hear it. And while you're popping your answers in the chat, I do want to share a little bit more about the center's change and implementation approach, which is on our next slide.
Slide title, Change and Implementation Principles. A circular diagram is shown on screen. There are 4 layers of the circle. The outer edge/layer is green and labeled Readiness. The second layer is blue and broken into 6 steps labeled Problem Exploration, Theory of Change, Intervention Selection and Design/Adaptation, Implementation Planning and Capacity Building, Intervention Testing, Piloting and Staging, and Monitoring, Evaluating, and Applying Findings. The third layer is yellow and labeled Teaming. And the middle/inner layer is the diagram's title, Effective Implementation.
So the center's change and implementation approach draws on research and findings from implementation science and organizational development. So those familiar with those fields may notice some key terminology in this diagram on your screen. And it moves through 8 key steps to help us know before we design, before we sustain. Agencies and teams can use these steps to guide change efforts, whether we're building on existing continuous quality improvement processes or taking on a wholly new project. At a high level, the process moves from analyzing the problem to researching potential solutions, all the way through monitoring and evaluating our outcomes. In addition to being stepwise, the C&I steps encourage teams to think critically about who is impacted by change and the impact that consensus building can have as a team understands a problem, designs a solution, and ultimately implements a change. So you'll see that 2 of these steps are rather continuous. Teaming and readiness are considered throughout the process. We all know that who we have at the table, as we say, or who we have on our team can really change the course of a project. But do we always think about the importance of gathering feedback and building consensus within that team as we move through a project? Revisiting teaming, as we've seen, can really help ensure that we have the skills, expertise, and conditions, more about that later, in place to help inform the change effort along the way. And taking time to think about readiness similarly throughout the process can help us really break down a project that can seem daunting. Oftentimes, I've found in my own work, focusing on the next step or the next step can help build momentum. And it helps us anticipate what's coming down the pike, but also focus on what's immediately at hand. You'll see 6 additional steps around the circle, and these help guide the team as you define the problem you're trying to solve and the goal you want to reach. We call that problem exploration. Determine the steps you'll take to get from where you are to where you want to be, or we call that theory of change. Determine what your solution will be and ensure that it meets the needs of your audience. We call this intervention selection and design or adaptation. Determine how you'll roll out your solution and what supports you'll need in place to do so. We call this implementation planning and capacity building, along with intervention testing, piloting, and staging, and how you'll define success and determine whether your solution is meeting the goal or needs some adjustments along the way. And we call this monitoring, evaluating, and applying findings. So I realize that the terminology or semantics may be a little bit different, but does it sound familiar to you? Perhaps a little bit like identifying goals, documenting business requirements, designing a system, piloting, and then releasing that system more broadly?
Jess, I was going to say, it sounds very familiar to me. And again, even using the language of implementation science, right? I think it's very applicable to the work that we do in technology and very aligned to, in our words, the software development lifecycle. right? And I think as we were first starting to work on this and looking at the change and implementation principles, it seemed very clear right off that, oh, these can be easily related to different phases in the software development lifecycle, which made it, again, this idea of the principles very applicable regardless of the language that we use, right? So just thinking for me very quickly, when you look at problem exploration, that's our planning phase for the technology. We're really looking at what are we trying to solve with this technology change with our CWIS. And then the analysis of that, really looking into it, are these the right changes, applying a theory of change to that. And then I think we all probably relate to selecting a type of platform or selecting the type of CWIS we want to implement, whether, again, we're going to buy a commercial off-the-shelf product or we're going to, configure a platform or even have a customized system built. That's what we're deciding in that intervention and selection phase. And moving on, when we're actually in the work and doing the system development, the more aligned with the design is also sort of in that intervention piece. And then building it around is the implementation phase of the principles. And then obviously for everybody who's done any sort of IT work, and especially system development, software development, the testing of that system, that software is always critical. And then the support, so monitoring the findings is once we go live, and the ongoing support and making sure that the system is working for people and we're getting the outcomes that we intended from our system implementation. So again, I thought this was very applicable to the work that we're doing and in this same structure. And obviously you don't do this work without a team, right? There always has to be a team at the table helping us with the implementation and being active participants in the work that we're doing. And then obviously, and I know we'll get more into this later, but readiness. I mean, if your users and your agency are not ready for this change, and at every stage of the change, it's probably going to be some roadblocks and some obstacles to truly being successful in your project. I do think my experience is that a lot of the work that we do, or a lot of the focus that we do, and maybe it's in other sectors as well, but in our child welfare and planning and implementation of systems, is we probably spend a lot of time in maybe selecting a system, and we definitely spend a lot of time in designing and the development of that system and testing. And that's why I'm really excited that these principles include the things that happened up front, right? More, are we really exploring the problems that we are trying to solve with this system implementation? And those problems can be both, and should be probably both, programmatic in nature as well as technology problems. We know that a lot of the systems are old. They've probably been around for years, and technology changes every 6 months almost, right? So there's always a need to implement new technologies, but making sure that the technologies that we're selecting are really solving the problem that we need to solve, and it really helps drive the outcomes and things that we're trying to achieve at the agency. So again, I thought this was really clear how much of the overlap there was between these principles and what we do in a software development lifecycle.
Absolutely. And Brady, I think you've brought up, but so many of those terms that we saw come forward in the poll at the top of the call are really key and run throughout this whole cycle, right? The emphasis on collaboration and building buy-in and momentum, and all of that is driven by a team, and I can really see the overlaps there as well.
Thank you. So Phil, next slide. Thank you. But you may still be thinking.
Slide title: Importance of Change and Implementation. 4 bullets summarizing the importance of change and implementation are read and described by presenter.
Okay, so this is great. This is interesting. A little bit, what is in it for me? Is this really that relevant that the DSS team is telling us and giving this information about change and implementation. I do want to reflect on some of the findings that we presented at the end of May when we did a review of our CCWIS reviews over the past 2 years, and some of the findings and things that we were seeing that were consistent, maybe some challenges that states were having with their implementations, right? And in some ways, going through these, you'll see that what folks are really asking for as we're seeing these as challenges is we need to use more of a change and implementation framework in our project. And I think having that will address some of these issues that we're seeing. So one is that the review teams have identified a need for increased teaming. Getting said that is central to the process of change and implementation is having a strong team, and also more informed problem explanation, right? So again, that we're clear on the problems that we're trying to solve with these systems, and those things are consistent throughout the project, right? We may need to change as new information comes in, but we're still focused on solving problems. Also, the need for consistent program and IT collaboration. And it's very clear around the teaming aspects of this and having the right voices at the table. The need to have the subject matter experts involved in planning and really in all phases of the project, but perhaps up front when we begin to do the problem exploration is having the subject matter experts at the table so that their voices are being heard, that we're understanding, again, what problems they may be seeing as needing to be solved with technology. And then finally, that change management is often just being limited to communication. Communication is key, it's critical, folks need to have information. But as you've seen, as Jess went over the principles, communication is just a part of what we need to do when we're using a change and implementation framework in our CCWIS projects.
Slide title, Benefits of Change and Implementation for CCWIS. 4 bullets summarizing the benefits of change and implementation for CCWIS are read and described by presenter.
Yes.
Yeah. And Brady, you mentioned something that I think, we've really heard in feedback as well. And I've experienced in my own personal life as well, is that sometimes, hindsight is 20/20. We don't know what we don't know. We get into a project and we think about the way we approach this would have been different if we had done X, Y, Z. And I think that really comes through when we think about taking a change and implementation approach. It is definitely a stepwise approach. And we've seen that folks who take the time to move through the approach together really can spend that time on identifying what needs to change and why. I will put a caveat here. We don't always have the luxury of starting at the very beginning. Sometimes we learn about something like change and implementation approach when we are already in a project, and that is okay. We can still go back to the problem that we know or what we believe the problem is and invite those additional voices and perspective, especially from those most impacted from our change, to maybe uncover more facets of the problem. We may have a really good understanding, but we may have a better understanding of what needs to change and why as we take this stepwise approach. And we've also found that, folks who approach it in this way can think about who needs to be included from the beginning and consistently involved. Right. Brady, you mentioned communication and the role of that in change and how that can impact alignment and how consistent communication can help that so much. And really thinking about the pathway we're going to take, right? What is going to get us from point A to point B? And how are we going to make sure that we're flexible enough to make those adjustments along the way? Because, oftentimes we take on projects around change knowing as much as we can. And we find ourselves needing to pivot or adjust. And that is what makes a project and change really responsive. So we want to make sure that, we have that flexibility as we move forward. And that, teams are really taking a look at all available solutions, right? Considering brand new or not yet created solutions in addition to ones that can be tweaked or improved for better outcomes. We also have
slide title, Benefits of Change and Implementation for CCWIS. 4 additional bullets summarizing the benefits of change and implementation for CCWIS are read and described by presenter.
We've also found that when teams are really looking at readiness consistently along. So Brady, one of the things that came up for me as you were talking through it was how much a team can change during change and how revisiting things like teaming and readiness can really help ground us in the now. Where are we as a team now? What supports do we need now to get to the next right step? And that the answers to those questions can really change throughout a project. And our needs can change depending what happens in the life cycle of a project. And as we revisit that topic of readiness and really grounding us in where we are, we can more thoughtfully plan and intentionally build the capacity that we need to take that next right step. The last things that I'll mention that are on this slide are really the importance of kind of testing our solution, our scaling. And Brady, I would imagine that folks have some experience in this too when it comes to systems development, that whether you're implementing a program or designing and implementing a system, that taking the time to test it on a smaller scale and make those adjustments before releasing it more broadly can really help to sustain that buy-in, that responsiveness, and really ensure that we're meeting our goals towards the end.
And I was going to comment too, I think you're right, and we've all sort of experienced this too, is that sort of staff turnover in projects, right? And so having a readiness plan and a readiness assessment that is continuous and throughout your project implementation helps you gauge, right? Like where is the staff in being prepared for this change, and how many new folks do we have and how do we address that? But keeping that in front of you continuously is an important part of being able to implement successfully. So thank you for raising that. So next slide, we also just wanted to quickly touch on
slide title, Staff Involvement in Change and Implementation. Header text reads, consider early and often who should be at the table throughout the project. Followed by 8 bullets of potential staff and people are read and described by presenter.
Who are the staff that you need involved in your change and implementation process as you're working on a CCWIS? So we want to consider early and often, be thinking about who needs to be here at the table. This isn't something you decide up front and then set it and move forward. But obviously you need your program staff. You want your IT team, their leadership. It's very important that leadership is at your table and their voice is heard, because we need their sponsorship for one thing, but we also need to know that they understand where we're going. They need to be champions of the change and also endorse it. Many of this, we have larger states, we have county administered states, we have regional offices. It's very important that everybody in those regions and county staff, that they are represented when you're having these discussions and they're part of your team. It's really important to have super users, people that will be your out in the field who know the system, who can also be bringing the communication to the larger staff. So and also your change can be your change champions as well. A lot of us are working with child welfare contributing agencies. Again, this is a critical part of delivering services to children and families, and also with the need to have that data in the CCWIS. It's really important that their voice is heard at the table. And finally, we cannot really emphasize this enough, but the work that we're doing in the CCWIS has an impact on real children and families in our communities, and it is just critical and really important from just the success factor of your system, but also that we're really helping to drive the kinds of outcomes and impacts that we want on children and families. That youth and families with lived experience are at the table, they're heard, and we're driving towards outcomes for them. So any other thoughts from folks about who might be not on this list but should be? You can drop it in the chat. You can come off mute if you'd like. Finance, Jennifer, finance, that is absolutely right. Can't believe we left that one off, but the financial folks really do need to be at the table, not just court. Agreed.
Yeah. And Brady, as folks start to put their responses in chat of those folks who are most important to have as a part of this team, also it makes me think about those folks who can help share their pain points around things, right? Yes. And as you were speaking about the change champions and your super users and our, youth and family, people with lived experience and expertise, that just kept coming up for me as, I know that we are all in the work of developing responsive solutions, and having those folks on board from the very beginning really just kept coming up for me.
Yeah. Right. I think we do want to take a moment here. We're about halfway through the presentation. I'm hoping that folks have heard some good ideas, a little bit intrigued with change and implementation, but did want to take a second just to see if there were any questions or comments or thoughts from the audience before we move on.
Hey, Brady, it's Phil. We haven't received any questions yet, but I did want to just encourage our attendees to ask questions. And we do appreciate the participation and engagement, both in the word cloud earlier, and now I'm seeing some come in through the chat. That's wonderful. Just as a reminder, though, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function at the top or bottom of your screen, and we'd love to respond to those. Also, you're able to raise your hand and we can unmute your line and you can just have a dialogue. I think our presenters would love to just kind of hear from you and hear how this is resonating, or maybe your experiences with change management or change and implementation. So thanks, Brady.
Thank you. So we can move on. Next slide.
Slide title, Mapping Change and Implementation to CCWIS, Upcoming Tool. 3 example pages of the tool are shown on screen. The first page is titled Teaming, the second is titled Problem Exploration, and the third is titled Readiness. Each document has a 2-column table with several rows. The first column is pre-filled with questions, and the second column is blank to allow the user to fill in their notes.
I'm going to turn this over to Jess in just a minute, but I did want to start with, so everything that we've talked about up to now does lead us to a tool. It's something that we're working on that will be published soon. You'll see it's not really overly complicated. I think the thought was, there's a lot of change management formats out there. There's a lot of templates. We could have inundated you all with templates, and a lot of process-oriented documents. We really thought that we wanted to start from a place that was simple, a little simpler, right? That really was presenting everyone, including us, with these questions that we should be asking ourselves through the process, right? And they're not even questions that we necessarily need to ask in formal settings. They're very appropriate to ask in sort of formal settings, but to really gather the information to sort of ground us where we are in the process, right? To make sure that we're thinking about some of these key factors for each of these principles as we're moving forward in our project, right? They're really here to somewhat challenge us, to get us thinking about change and implementation, and then to have a place to gather the information in these notes, right? So you're going to see we've gone through each one of the principles. We've got a set of questions here that you can use to, again, drive you to gathering the information around these questions. And then you may turn them into something that you want to ask on a formal basis, right? And they may turn into a plan as well. But again, our purpose here and thought was, let's just really start with a tool and a tip sheet that is going to create this curiosity, generate a lot of good questions, and hopefully get you to to be thinking about what do we need to be thinking about at each one of these phases and steps in a change and implementation process.
Absolutely. And Brady, if I could just share from
Please.
our side too, we were so excited when the idea for this collaboration came up, and that it was driven by so many pieces of feedback from states and jurisdictions who were really, really wanting to make meaningful and impactful change. And as Brady mentioned, one of our goals was to make this as simple as possible. And so the tool itself, right, helps teams come together at each of these steps. It's not the expectation that every question on this tool would be completed at one time, but instead that teams would use this and revisit this over time to have those conversations and spark that discussion that's really going to build alignment and help with consensus building.
And I do think there's some questions about when the tool is going to be released. I saw those. We are working on it. It's just going through a couple of last rounds of review to make sure it is signed off on by the Children's Bureau. And so we're hoping that it's released sometime, at least via email, that we can send it out sometime this week.
Side title, Mapping Change and Implementation to CCWIS, Teaming. 2 rows of the teaming tool are shown on screen. The first column includes pre-filled questions to consider that are read and described by presenter. The second column, for notes, is blank.
So we also, as you saw, we gave you an example of what the tool is going to look like for a few sheets, but we didn't want to go over every one of the questions. That would be a little overwhelming. We don't have the time, but we're just going to start with a few of the principles and a few of the questions and give some examples of how we might use this, or just like thinking through some of the questions. So Jess?
Yes. So as Brady mentioned, right, the goal of showing you the snapshots in the slide before was not to make you read at a 4-point font, but it was to help you get a feel for the structure of this tool. And so for each step in the change and implementation, the team has developed questions that are specific or maybe especially helpful for child welfare program and IT teams to consider as they move through this process. And really, when we think about starting, we kept coming back to teaming. So much of this connects back to who we have on our team and who is helping us to understand or validate what we believe we understand about the problem and the goal. And so a couple of the questions that you'll see in this teaming section specifically are around the skills that your team believes are really critical to have, at the table to engage in these conversations and to help uncover those facets of the problem that we talked about earlier. And who on that team specifically can do some really critical roles. Things like updating business processes, and who are going to be the change and implementation experts that help guide this project. And I know I've seen some of that in the chat. And Brady, I just wonder if there's anything specific to these skills and abilities, or taking the time to really think about the roles and responsibilities on a team that we've seen come out in these CCWIS or in the feedback that we've gotten.
Well, I think a lot of and thank you, Jess, and I'm just going to confess right here to everybody that we had decided a few moments before the webinar that I was going to take this slide. So you see how good Jess is at change. Is she took it and ran with it, and I appreciate that. So, I think when we think about the skills that the team needs to have, as folks were dropping the names of who should be at the table into the chat, you think a lot about that's true, right? We need child welfare can be a complicated field, right? And when you bring IT into it, that's another level of complexity, but making sure you have your finance people there, right? And sometimes you've got one or two people maybe who are handling a really key part of a process or in your agency. We need to make sure those voices are heard. And so when we think about skill, maybe it's not just a technical skill. That's obviously really important too. But even thinking broadly about the skills that you need to have on the team, right? And we could probably go through a list of all of them here, and then we'd probably miss something that was important to have. So I think it is just thinking about all that, but thinking very broadly, being very thoughtful and planful about who needs to be at the table to really help your system implementation be successful. I did want to, go ahead, Jess.
I was just going to say, Brady, I mean, you mentioned it, but there are going to be questions that are specific to each individual team. And so while these are, food for thought, they get you started, we really hope that they support your team in moving forward. They're, taking the time to think about those things that are unique to your own team and the roles or skills that you're going to need. I just want to make sure to lift that up because really important.
Hey, Brady, this is Phil.
Yes, sir.
As you guys talk about thinking about who should be on your team, there was a great question that came in, and they said one of their biggest challenges is about capacity, and who can really lead these types of efforts, and just the effort that takes. And their question specifically was around, can you contract out the project management of this type of change? Is that a loaded question a little bit? Yeah.
I think it might be a loaded question. And I can I think I can say I'll answer maybe just from my perspective right now, right? And if there's anybody from the federal team who wants to weigh in or carry that later, I do think this to me feels like the change in implementation and making true change is something. I use really touchy-feely words, so I apologize if that doesn't resonate with somebody, but it's a very intimate thing for an agency, right? And I feel like it's hard. It would probably be difficult to really get the kind of change that's needed if you are contracting that out to somebody who hasn't lived within your agency and can really be keenly aware of the type of change that needs to be made based on history, based on context. I think if you're saying maybe manage the pieces of the process, that's probably doable. But I think, again, change, even when you think about it from a real personal perspective, right? Like you might hire a trainer if you want to change your physical, but actually making that change is something you have to do yourself, right? So that is my sort of touchy-feely answer. And I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that with something a little bit more practical.
No, Brady, I mentioned it earlier that, we think about the conditions needed for change. And as you were talking, it did make me think about trust and, making sure we understand what is going to be the environment that folks feel comfortable being honest about the change that needs to be made. And so that came up for me as well around whether you choose to facilitate it fully internally or have someone step in to help.
So, Jess, I do, if I can sort of ask a question from maybe a change in implementation science perspective, right? Because capacity is an issue, right? It's like, is this like feeling like you're adding one more thing on the plate of a staff that's already maybe overwhelmed and burdened? And I wonder if that's a part of what would be considered when you're assessing for readiness, right? Like, are folks at such a high capacity already that they're not ready for another change? And is that something is usually considered?
Absolutely. And looking at capacity through those, dimensions of organizational capacity, right? Like looking at where we are as an organization, what we have available to us and the solution that's really doable for where we are, and knowing that is okay. I love seeing that the chat is on fire. But I do think that it's one of the reasons why we revisit readiness consistently throughout the process is that answers to those questions may change over time, and bringing us back to those conversations.
Stephanie, I think if one of the federal analysts, if anybody else wanted to weigh in.
Yes, I was going to just go ahead and chime in here a little bit. I am seeing some great peer responses from your other states in the chat. I just did want to say that in talking with your federal analyst, in your planning, you can include change management work. You can include contracting change management work. Your state may not have capacity. You may not have the training or the staff. And so you may want to contract some of your change management work. Speaking to Brady's point, of course, that leadership and that training and work on change management should absolutely include your own staff and building that capacity within your staff. But it is work that we have successfully seen contracting out for that role of training and leadership and bringing the processes into place to work with your staff.
I do think too, the one thing I was thinking as we continue talking about this is even if there is a vendor or somebody you bring in to do change management, I think that answering these kind of questions and knowing that whoever is leading that change is also getting this information from the state is really critical, because I don't think you know who needs to be at the table, and even getting down to the names of those people who need to be at the table is always going to be something that the state jurisdiction is going to be driving, right? And making sure that vendor, as you're paying them to help lead your change management, is aware of the things that are important to you as an agency, right? And the change that you're trying to implement. I know we're actually at 10 minutes and we have a few more, but I did really want to, I think we're good if we don't get through all of them necessarily, because it's a little self-explanatory. But even thinking about having the right people at the table, this second question that we're presenting here about teaming is actually some of the information comes directly from getting the voice of somebody with lived experience in some work that we were doing at DSS. Right. And it was a foster parent who had been asked to help participate. I think it was I don't know if it was a CCWIS project, but another project. But she was being asked to come during business hours for the agency. But she was a full-time.
Slide title: Mapping Change and Implementation to CCWIS. Problem Exploration. 2 rows of the Problem Exploration tool are shown on screen. The first column includes pre-filled questions to consider that are read and described by presenter. The second column for notes is blank.
She had a full-time job and she had to drive 45 minutes just to get to the office where these meetings were being held. And she really was encouraging us and think about, like, if you want the voice of people from lived experience, you may have to make and will have to make adjustments to really meet folks where they are, right? And rather than asking others to maybe make a change in their life to be able to help us meet our need, it's can we change the way that we're doing things to be able to get the voices at the table that we need to have there. And that was, again, just an example of actually having the lived experience voice at the table. I don't think we would have had that question quite the same way in our tool if we hadn't had that person at the table for some other project work that we were doing. So we can move on to problem exploration. And again, this is one where really think it is important that we ground ourselves in the what is it we are really trying to solve with the changes that we're looking at making with our CCWIS implementation, and making sure that there is an understanding, right? And everybody has the same understanding. I think that's one of the problems is folks might have their own understanding. And so you want to get many different voices in. All of those different voices may be describing or commenting on the same problem, but with a different perspective, a different voice. And it's making sure that we're hearing that, we're putting that into the context of the solution, and that is understood and shared across the team. And is this last question, is the team at risk of solving the wrong problem? And I think without the proper problem exploration, that's really driven a lot in data. And you'll see that on the tool, there's actually some questions about what are the research questions that you're asking, what's the data, and basing your problem that you're solving around data and making sure that there's evidence that that's the right problem. I had an old coworker who would say, are we implementing a $10 million solution for a $10,000 problem? Or vice versa, right? And I think those are important questions to ask yourselves is this, are we doing the right thing to solve the right problem? And then also you see just collectively does the team see this as an opportunity and as a major change? Because again, we're saying everything that we're doing is a change, and we need to make sure that folks understand that and are ready for the change as well. Last question here too is, does the team understand what must stay the same, right? And some things are critical, right, that you just can't change that, right? And with the new technologies of being aware, is that going to fundamentally change the way we have done a really key practice that really can't change, right? And so being clear on those things as well is what is going to be the impact of the system that you're implementing on your practice, and what things really can't be impacted by this new change is equally as important as understanding what can change.
Slide title, Mapping Change and Implementation to CCWIS. Readiness. 2 rows of the readiness tool are shown on screen. The first column includes pre-filled questions to consider that are read and described by presenter. The second column for notes is blank.
Yeah, thanks, Brady. So as Brady mentioned, we've said many times, we will revisit readiness throughout this entire process. And every question that we've talked about so far has been really people driven. And a lot of our readiness questions are going to be driven by the responses of our team, where our team is, and what we really have the ability to do. And so the questions you'll find in the readiness section of the tool are very focused on that. And you may find that some of these questions are more relevant at certain stages in a change process. But thinking about things like, how are you going to gather feedback and communicate planning, right? We talked about the importance of communication throughout this entire conversation, and I've been seeing it in the chat, and I saw it in the poll at the beginning of the call, and how that communication really ties to our ability to collaborate as a team, and hold a shared vision for where we go. Brady, you just said it, what needs to change versus what needs to stay the same, and having that be really informed. And, the second question we peppered in for this topic was also thinking about key implementation supports. So, and many folks have talked about this in the chat, things like coaching or change champions, or do we need to bring in someone to help us facilitate this change management process, in addition to things like training, and what are the things that are going to help us with testing and adoption?
And one thing that just came to mind, Jess, as you were talking about this and thinking about all of this change and implementation principles, but especially around maybe readiness, is how much this is a risk mitigation strategy too, right? Of making sure your staff and the team is ready for this change, really having that assessed in advance, having a plan to address the readiness and making sure the team is ready, really will help you avoid pitfalls when you get to that point of we're ready to implement, right?
Absolutely.
That is not the point. And when we want to realize that your agency is not ready for this change, right? So thinking about this too is a way to really mitigate potential risks early on, just because you're assessing the whole time is, are we ready for this? Where are we in the readiness, right? And maybe we're not ready, but how do we get people ready for the change, right? Where do we need to spend an additional effort to really make sure that we're ready when the time comes. So
absolutely.
Yes, so I know we're at 4 minutes left, and earlier today I was worried we would not have enough to cover a full hour, and we could probably keep going. So, are there any questions, Phil, before we move on?
There's some good communication happening in the chat, but we don't have any questions currently in the queue, so I think we're ready to advance.
All right, thank you.
Slide title, Additional Change and Implementation Resources. capacity.child-welfare.gov/states/topics/CQI/change-implementation. Several examples of the web page's resources, such as at-a-glance briefs, are shown on screen.
Well, you've heard us talk a lot about the center's change and implementation approach, and I've seen some comments in the chat too about other change management frameworks. What we can offer from the center is we have an entire series of resources related to the change and implementation approach. So Brady mentioned, the goal with this tool was to think about how we could keep it simple, but also build on what we've seen be successful. And so if you're finding that you want to know more about a specific step in the change and implementation process, we have those resources for you. On the center's website, we have a series, the Change and Implementation and Practice series. It walks you through each of the 8 steps. There's an overview video if you want to build your team's collective shared understanding of what that process looks like at a high level before you take on a project like this. And there's also a series of recently updated at a glance. These are 2-page documents that give you a very high level what is accomplished at each of these steps, how to get the most out of this, how to think about advancing equity as you walk through each of these steps. And all of that can be found on the center's website. And thank you so much, Kim, who just shared the link to those resources in the chat.
Slide title, Additional DSS Resources. www.acf.hhs.gov/cb/training-technical-tribal-info-systems. CCWIS Technical Bulletin Number 7 URL reads www.acf.hhs.gov/cb/training-technical-CWIS-TB-7. Webinar and training materials URL reads www.acf.hhs.gov/state-tribal-info-systems/state-tribal-info-systems/training.
All right, so we also have additional DSS resources. There is information not maybe specifically or directly related to change and implementation, but as you know, we've got the Technical Bulletin 7, which talks about the technical assistance, self-assessment tools, and monitoring reviews. And also, we always have our series of webinars and training materials available to states. And we're looking forward to continuing work around this change in implementation, especially with publishing the tool soon.
Slide title, Questions and Answers. On-screen text read by moderator.
Absolutely. I'll just share. I'm so excited to share this tool. I'm really looking forward to hearing feedback. And I saw that the survey link was also included in the chat.
Wonderful. Well, we are just about at time. I did want to remind folks that if they have questions following today's webinar, that you can send those to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov, or you can reach out to your federal analyst as well. These slides will be made available after the webinar along with the recording once those are posted. So thank you all for being here. I want to remind our participants to complete the satisfaction survey.
Slide title, Webinar Satisfaction Survey. On-screen text explaining the CCWIS webinar participant survey, summarized by moderator.
You can use the QR link on the slide, or there will also be a link that will pop up when you leave the webinar. So your feedback is very important to us. I want to once again thank our speakers, both Jessica Walls and Brady Birdsong. Wonderful presentation today. I think many of us took some great tidbits out of this. And I want to thank also our participants for the great work they are doing on behalf of children and families, and to our host, Children's Bureau. Thanks again for being here, and that will conclude today's webinar.